Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Stress and burnout have both been important parts of the conversation about what's going on at the workplace. But the other thing to consider is the state of employee mental health. This is an equally important topic of conversation that deserves our time and our attention. This is something that has come into focus, especially over the last several years. One of the driving forces for bringing this topic of conversation into focus is research. Research consistently shows us that more and more employees are reporting that their mental health is on the decline. For example, some research is suggesting that over 40% of employees have consistently reported a decline in their mental health since about the time of the beginning of the pandemic. That is a serious concern, and that absolutely should be a serious concern, a very serious concern for any and every organization out there. Because when we look at something like the well-being of employees, it should never be thought of or seen as something that's isolated and relating simply to the individuals, but rather it's something that affects not only individuals but also the collective and the organization as a whole. Today I want to talk about how employers can support employee mental health and their well-being in the mental health area. Employers have the responsibility and the opportunity to support the well-being of their employees, and that includes the mental health that employees are experiencing. Let's face it, individuals spend a lot of their time, a lot of their waking hours at work, so there's absolutely no way that we can make any kind of assumptions thinking that the work environment does not play some kind of role or some kind of contribution to one's mental health. So, having said that, we also have to accept that employers have the opportunity and the responsibility all in one to support employee mental health and well-being. So, first things first, one of the most important things that employers can do is to have their leaders and their managers model healthy behavior. We can promote healthy behavior all day long, but if we're not modeling healthy behavior as leaders within an organization, as managers within an organization, then our efforts are that much more challenged in terms of coming to realization, coming to fruition. So it's very important that leadership, that management model healthy behavior for individual employees. The other thing that is tremendously important is communications. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I think there's already a lot of talk about the lack of proper and consistent and open communications at organizations in general. But when we talk about supporting employees and supporting their well-being, specifically their mental health, communication is critical. Communication is one way of knowing what's going on, exchanging information between employer and employee. So communication is key. I cannot stress enough the importance of communication. When an organization realizes and accepts their responsibility and their opportunity to support their employees in any way, but for today's discussion, in terms of mental health and well-being, communication is absolutely key. And that brings me to the next point, which is the company's culture. The organization has to build a culture of connection and inclusion. Whatever the culture is today, it can always be changed or it can always be improved. So it is the organization's responsibility to build a culture that focuses on connectivity and inclusion. Culture is one of those top-down things that flows from the top down. So we can attempt to make changes from the bottom up, but it's not very effective. The changes have to come from the top, from leadership, from management. This is how cultures are formed and sustained throughout the years. So absolutely, the organization has to build the kind of culture that will support its employees, that will support mental health and well-being. And that means a culture of connectivity and inclusion. Something else to consider is the simple act of offering flexibility to your employees, whether that means flexible hours, flexible schedules, flexible working locations, whatever that means. That should be part of the working experience for your employees as an organization. This is something that should be a conversation, an ongoing conversation between the employer and the employees. This is something that should be crafted with both sides working on it together. This is something that should be seen as continually growing and evolving, something that is not set in stone, but rather something that is able to change as the needs and requirements change. So it's so important that the employer be flexible in the relationship that it has with employees. Then organization has to be flexible in terms of the relationship that it has with its employees. So however that is defined will often depend on individuals. It will absolutely change over time. So it must be something that is fluid. It must be something that is changing and growing with the passage of time. You can't be rigid and unyielding and expect people to thrive in those kinds of conditions. So as an employer, as an organization, it is absolutely critical to offer flexibility to your employees. Another way in which an organization can support employee mental health and well-being is by offering different types of trainings. Trainings such as stress management, trainings such as conflict resolution, things that will help employees to manage their daily experiences, to manage their stress, to contribute to their well-being. Things such as self-care seem so simple, but should never be taken for granted. These are the types of things that definitely should be offered to employees by the organization, by the employer. You would be surprised how many people would benefit from such trainings and the change that applying what was learned in these trainings can actually make for both individuals and collectively for the workforce as a whole. That brings me to the next idea. It's important that organizations offer and encourage the use of employee assistance programs. And oftentimes, employees don't even realize that these employee assistance programs even exist within an organization, or when they do realize that something is available, that something does exist, they're often not encouraged to take advantage of these benefits, to use these benefits, whether it's because of time constraints or stigmas that are associated with using these benefits. It is the employer's responsibility to not only offer such benefits, but to actually encourage that people participate, that people use, that people take advantage of these kinds of benefits. And this is part of the culture, a culture that encourages self-care and well-being will not be a culture that has any kind of judgment associated with using these benefits. So again, this is a big responsibility, but also a big opportunity for employers to promote employee assistance programs, their usage, and their benefits for their employees. You can't take much of a responsibility if you don't know what's going on within your own organization. So knowing what's going on is key, but things such as communication, this is when it comes into practice. This is when communication can reveal tremendous amounts of information. And you have to, as an employer, know what's going on both with individuals, but also collectively with your workforce. So knowing what's going on allows you to make changes that may be beneficial, that may be necessary for the well-being of your employees. And that brings me to the next point, which is proper assessment of what's going on, of how whatever you may have already implemented is working, and from there making the changes that may be necessary, that may be required. Sometimes an organization may put something in place that works beautifully. Maybe it works well for a long time, maybe it works well for a short time, but only through assessment of how it's working, and if it's working, can you actually make improvements? Maybe something was put into place, but it ended up not working well at all. Rather than making decisions that are based on finances or emotional attachment to some training or program that was recently implemented, it's important to focus on its benefits for the employees and their wellness, and make the decisions based on what will be best for the organization in that way, in those terms. So again, knowing what's going on, being able to assess the effectiveness of whatever is currently in place, and being able to make changes and updates and upgrades as necessary is key. Nothing should ever be written in stone when we talk about things such as supporting employee well-being, and specifically in this conversation, employee mental health. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Employee well-being should be part of everybody's conversation, and when we talk about mental health, every organization has the responsibility and the opportunity to support their employees. And this is what today's episode is all about: how managers and leaders of organizations can support their employees, their well-being, and their mental health. And of course, modeling healthy behaviors, modeling self-care is the first order of business. But beyond that, an organization must engage in things such as communication. It must offer trainings for self-care, stress management, conflict resolution. It must understand what is and isn't working. And that's where the communication, making assessments, making decisions, making changes as required is key. This is a fluid approach, something that grows with time. Creating the right culture, being flexible in terms of benefits and how employees are allowed to work within the organization are also key. So there are plenty of ways that an organization can support their employees in terms of their well-being, in terms of their mental health. But what is key is being proactive. The organization must recognize the importance of employee well-being and employee mental health, and it must recognize its own contribution and its own opportunity and responsibility to participate, to be proactive, and to help. And as a final note, I want to point out that it's important for individual employees to speak up. If there's something that you need from your employer, please do not be afraid of asking, speaking up, and addressing. If you get what you need, then your experience at the workplace may be that much better. If you don't get what you need, maybe you can get something else. It doesn't hurt to ask. Don't expect the employer to guess all of the right things that they can do or that they should do for you. Don't expect the employers to magically know what would work best and what would be best for your well-being. So don't be afraid to speak up and to ask for what you need from the employer. As the week unfolds, I encourage everybody to think about mental health and specifically how employers can support employee mental health. And while in this episode I outlined some specific ways for employers to engage in this kind of support, I also want to encourage individual employees to seek out the help that they need, to ask for the support that they feel would benefit them. If you don't ask, you can't expect your employer to know everything that you may need, everything that would be helpful to you, or to guess correctly what kind of support might be the most beneficial for you. So as much as I want to bring the importance of this to the employers, I also want to remind individual employees to speak up, to ask for the kind of support that you need, because that will be helpful to your employer in terms of what they can do to provide the best possible support for their employees. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. In addition to the video version of the podcast, my YouTube channel also contains videos that focus on stress management. So I encourage you to check out Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.